I think there's two answers to that question. One is the data is becoming abundant and visually accessible on the web. So one reason is people are not going to the source. There are a lot of source information. There's a lot of models, that predictive models of sea level rise. You can see exactly where the high tide is going to get to over the next decade or two, and more extraordinarily over the next century or so. And you can actually use tools online to adjust the sea level to see if your kitchen is going to be underwater several times over a few years during high tide. And I'm not talking about storm surge, I'm talking about high tide levels. So it is accessible in the air. And the other is that as a society, we're not including enough Earth system science in our schooling, in our education, to be able to understand the nature of the rice coast that we live in, this incredible area from just north of Jacksonville to just south of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, which is so dynamic and so changeable. When you add sea level rise type climate change things on top of that, we really do have to make sure that the whole community is involved, because it's not going to be today's leaders so much as tomorrow's leaders. They're going to have to deal with the outcomes of what we know is happening. Well, sea level is always changing. In fact, it changes every day. The only time sea level is not changing right here is at the exact moment of high tide and low tide, 2 high tides and 2 low tides a day. And at all other times, the sea level is changing, and it changes every day. High tides are higher, low tides are lower, based on the position of the sun and moon and about 22 other variables. And on top of that, we have been measuring sea level rise over the past few decades at a fairly constant rate. So what we're seeing right here on Cockspur Island and Fort Pulaski is we're starting to see the heroic efforts to conserve cultural resources from rising sea level. Right where we are on this North Pier, which is very historical and very valuable, as is this National Historic Site, it is eroding to the rate of so fast that they needed to do something extraordinary, and they had the Corps of Engineers, which has to maintain the Savannah River ship channel for the larger vessels now, the post-Panamax shipping container vessels. They got them to dump some of their dredge spoil right here to conserve this pier and this side of Cockspur Island and this historic resource. I don't know the extent to which it changed the mind of Georgians, especially when there are some who won't even evacuate the coastal zone when they predict a storm surge of 12 feet. Fortunately, Matthew didn't have a storm surge of 12 feet. It had a storm surge that was just above the highest of the high tides during the year, and it flooded houses in some places. But I saw the aftermath of it, and this was just a glancing blow. The wind and currents from Hurricane Matthew were going from north to south. And it's just remarkable as I explore these small islands around here, how much damage was done, how much shoreline was eroded, and how much debris was blasted through the remaining maritime live oak forest. A lot of people were have been cleaning this debris up from their marshfront property for some time on the north sides of these islands. So that was just a mild, Category 1, 2, mild glancing blow hurricane. A major hurricane coming ashore here. Think Katrina, think Sandy, think much greater rearrangement of the geography. Ensuring that plans are in place by the agencies that are responsible for public health and safety, principally. But we have to look at the entire infrastructure of a society. If we expect to continue to inhabit barrier coastal islands that without human habitation would migrate on their own all over the place, we have to be prepared for the expense and consequences to maintain infrastructure, roads, electricity, water, sewage, and all of those things in the face of very significant sea level changes. Now, the reason this is called the Rice Coast is because almost all of the estuaries in this huge band along the Rice Coast were converted into rice for rice cultivation. And one of the reasons that that was done was because the water on the coast was much more brackish. In fact, there was probably far more fresh water than salt water on this coastline. So it wasn't too difficult to dike off sections of the salt marsh and turn it into rice cultivation. I don't think that could be done today at all, because the salinities along the coast, the saltiness of the water, has increased so much. There used to be freshwater springs flowing springs all along the coast and in the water, even offshore, as well as a lot of freshwater input. Now, essentially, there's no fresh water coming subsurface because it's all been pumped for industry, municipal use, agriculture, and there's essentially no fresh water coming subsurface anymore. Even during the 35 years that I've been here, the average salinities when I came were in the 22 to 25 part per thousand. Of course, it's much lower when it rains and it's much higher when there are droughts, but that was sort of the average. Today, those averages are up in the 30 parts per thousand, and seawater, full-strength seawater from the ocean, is about 35 to 36. So we're seeing a significant salinification of this Rice Coast, and particularly in Georgia and southern South Carolina. And the consequences we can't predict. As much as data as we can collect, we cannot predict the biogeographic consequences. We experienced in the early 2000s, a die-off of salt marsh grasses that had never been seen in living memory. People were calling the Department of Natural Resources, Savannah State University, Skidoo Institute of Oceanography, what's going on? The marshes behind my house are dying. And this had never been seen before. It was reported in South Carolina and in Louisiana. And so scientists started getting out there trying to figure out what was going on with marshes dying back. At the same time, blue crabs in the sounds, and typical harvest of blue crabs in Georgia is about 4 million pounds per year. Blue crabs were dying back to the point where you couldn't even find them. We found out what was happening with the blue crabs. It turned out to be a protozoan blood parasite called hematodinium that was incredibly virulent and caused their death, and to where there were fishermen that could not catch any blue crabs out there. As it turns out, hematodinium, this parasite, proliferates in regular ocean seawater, and the less salty, brackish water of the coast kept this parasite at bay through most of hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years of this low salinity coastline. So these poor blue crabs were not equipped genetically to deal with this parasite coming in, doing well in higher salinity waters. And it took getting lower salinity waters in here for the blue crabs to come back. Now, these things are not predictable. Blooms and die-offs and diebacks and things like that kind of hit you from blindside you, because there's no way you can collect enough data. Nature is far too complex to be able to model down to the scale of individual species in an ecosystem. So we have to kind of play it by ear, and that's why we have to be smart and nimble and ready to understand the changes that we know are coming, that we can see coming, and those that we don't see coming. For example, harmful algal blooms. We haven't had any significant harmful algal blooms, toxic algae, microalgae that bloom and are toxic. We haven't seen that significantly on this lower salinity coastline of the Rice Coast and the Low Country. But as salinities increase, we're going to become more like the states further south, Florida, North Carolina, that have seen these harmful algal blooms. So we have to be prepared. It's like you have to know and have it be part of your education and culture to notify people when you see something different in nature. We have to be nimble. People have to know that if you see the tide going out way farther than it should be, there might be a tsunami coming and you need to run. So it's just a matter of being smart. It's being prepared. Well, government and leadership are elected by the people. And if the people are educated and understand and are smart, they will elect people who are rational and look at the facts and make rational decisions. So it's simply a matter of education, in my view. The climate change issues that a place like Tybee Island are going to face in the future are really no different than the ones that they've been facing for as long as they've been there, which is these barrier islands of sand are dunes that move around. And once you build roads and houses and infrastructure on them, you tend to want to stabilize that sand dune. And they've done all manner of stabilization over the years: groins, jetty, riprap. Pumping sand and renourishment seems to be the main choice now. But this is just an ongoing process. And with sea level rise, it's just going to have to continue, and it's going to have to keep up. And the infrastructure on the island is going to have to keep up. The roads are going to have to be raised or a bridge made if you want to maintain the community and the economy of a vulnerable barrier island. Absolutely not possible to save all barrier islands. There's not enough money in anyone's budget to pump enough sand to maintain the coastline of the southeast of the United States and much of the southeast of barrier islands. Now, a place that's fully built out and developed and is an important source of revenue, economics, recreation, everything, those places like Hilton Head, South Carolina, and Tybee Island, Georgia, they will probably invest heroic amounts of money to maintain communities there. Other undeveloped barrier islands will continue to do what they have done for hundreds, thousands, and millions of years and just migrate around. There's one spot that I've been to on the north end of Wausau Island, taken students to for over 30 years to give you some scope of the change. A dune field right there on that north end that I went to for the first time in the early 1980s eroded totally and became ocean. After that, a bar or spit formed, not unlike the one right here, and walled off a section of water that became a large tide pool. That tide pool became a healthy salt marsh. That healthy salt marsh then started getting smaller as the beach dunes built out in front of it. Eventually, that entire pool, pond, and salt marsh were covered with sand again, and it became a dune field. And that process repeated itself at least twice during that 30 years. So that's the example of a very, very dynamic back and forth sort of a spot. But as sea levels rise, there's going to be a net movement of islands in one direction or the other, probably landward. But we can't predict. With all the data that's generated and all the imagery and everything else, we really can't predict the exact spots and nature of how these barrier islands are going to move. I gave a presentation to a group of homeowners on one of the non-barrier islands, but they're islands not right on the ocean, but back a ways from the ocean, not too long ago. And I used the tide level predictor tool that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration provides, that you can go online and use a little slider. Now that slider shows where the shoreline and what areas will be underwater with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 feet of additional sea level. For example, I will be getting water into my kitchen at about 3 feet. If you push it up to 6 feet, many, many homes, large number of homes in the counties along the coast here under. But that 6 feet may still not accurately reflect the extraordinary amount of global warming and hence expansion of oceans from increasing temperature and increased amount of water from the melting of ice sheets, principally in Antarctica and Greenland. So we could be looking at there are predictions as high as 8 feet within a century. So if you kind of project that back, we're gonna get our feet wet in our kitchens much sooner than later. I've always maintained that getting out in nature and understanding where you live and the forces that are impinge upon the place where you live is very important to the health and development of people. And I think that is, there's data to show that people are healthier who spend time out in nature. I would get kids out in nature, and I would also equip them in the classroom early and often in earth system sciences, applying what they learn in their science and other things to, you know, how the planet works. Sure. The impacts of salinification, temperature change, are significant. The best predictor of the distribution of marine life, things that live in the ocean, are temperature and salinity. As our coast gets warmer and saltier, we're going to see changes in the abundance and distribution of things. Some things will get less abundant, some things will get more abundant. We'll probably see some things we hadn't seen here before, and we may even lose some things. So biogeography, the study of the distribution of living things over the landscape or seascape over time and through space, is always changing. Just like the geography is always changing, the biogeography is always changing. So we can expect to see changes. The exact nature of those changes, like I mentioned before, are not always predictable because nature is so complex that we can't model it down to the finest details. We can't collect enough data to know perfectly the operation of all ecosystems. So I expect we've had pressure on fisheries from overfishing and habitat loss, and if we lose salt marshes because we don't allow them to migrate upland because we've built those up, and our salt marshes get smaller and smaller, then the habitat, which is nursery for the larval stages of marine life, gets smaller and smaller. And it only makes sense, as you decrease the habitat of a nursery, you're going to decrease the productivity in fisheries. So between overfishing and loss of habitat, you know, we could see a real significant loss of harvestable, economically beneficial marine life.